Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this event. Please take your seats so we can start the event. We have our friends from C-SPAN here, and we have people who are watching this live from all around the country, perhaps all around the world. We're delighted. I'm really honored to once again have the opportunity to talk about the handoff of the chairmanship of the Republican Study Committee. This is an event that we've been doing going back to my earliest days as president of the American Enterprise Institute. We did it for the first time in the first handoff after I was president in 2010, and we've done it every time since here at AEI. We're very privileged to do that because of the distinct nature of the work of the Republican Study Committee, but also because we get to present to you, those who are interested in this work, and people around the country, some of the brightest up-and-coming newer leaders in Congress. I have two of them with me here today. The Republican Study Committee, which was formed in 1973, is basically the group of conservatives, those of conservative ideology and policy making in the U.S. House of Representatives. It's been around for a long time and has grown tremendously over the years. 2 years ago, it was outgoing Chairman Bill Flores who introduced incoming Chairman Mark Walker. This year, outgoing Chairman Mark Walker, I should note in the bylaws of the Republican Study Committee, you can't serve for more than 2 years. Nobody's getting fired here. This year, outgoing Chairman Mark Walker is introducing incoming Chairman Mike Johnson. And I'll give you a little bit of a background on them in a minute, but I want to elaborate on something I just said. One of the great things about the Republican Study Committee is that the way that they select people who are relatively new in Congress is a great indicator on who's going to have a big career in the U.S. House of Representatives. It's a major position because it's such an important group and now mainstream conservative group of members of Congress. They look for leaders that people haven't quite heard of yet because they've been relatively newly elected. Mark Walker was starting his second term when he was elected to the chairmanship. The same thing is true of Mike Johnson, just starting his second term. Mark Walker came in 2014. Mike Johnson came in 2016. Let me introduce them now, and then we'll go on to our event. Mark Walker, to my right, he represents the 6th Congressional District of North Carolina. I mentioned he was first elected in 2014 and has chaired the RSC since 2017, since the beginning of his second term. In addition to chairing RSC, he serves on the House Oversight and Government Reform Committees and the Committee on House Administration. Before entering politics, Mark was a pastor for 2 decades, and he also worked in business and financial management. He's a person of deep faith, deep conviction, somebody who's been very helpful to me in my own work here in Washington, D.C., and has been a source of real inspiration to a lot of us. He's also a musician, something that we have in common. He's a composer. I think you play keyboards or guitar?
Keyboards.
Keyboards. Wrote a lot of the original compositions that were played in his church, something I admire very much. He's also known for his Elvis impression, which he will not be doing today, unless he wants to. No, he's the chairman.
Exactly right.
Yeah. Representative Mike Johnson, who represents the 4th District of Louisiana, he came in just in 2016, brand new incoming chairman of RSC, was elected by his colleagues, as is always the case. In addition to his new role, he serves on the House Judiciary and Natural Resources Committees, and was only one of 3 freshman members to chair a House subcommittee in the 115th Congress. Once again, RSC is a source of talent scouting for who will be representing in a very big way the GOP in the coming years. Before this, he was a practicing constitutional lawyer and provided legal counsel for a lot of conservative policy organizations over the past 2 decades, a service for which we thank you in our community. I'm really grateful to both of you for joining us today, and we're looking forward to this conversation. I'm going to start off with 20 or 25 minutes of questions that I have, and then I'm going to turn it over to all of you in the audience. So if you've got questions, get them ready. Since we're on television today, the ground rules will be when we go to the Q&A, you're going to have to wait for the microphone. We'll give you the microphone. You'll say your name. You'll make your statement in the form of a question. And then we'll go to our outgoing and incoming chairman. So I'm going to start with you, Mark.
Sure.
Welcome to AEI.
Thank you, Arthur. Always good to be with you guys.
And thank you for your friendship and for all the good things you've done for me and for us here at AEI. Since we've got a C-SPAN audience here, not all of whom are really familiar with the Republican Study Committee and its work, tell us what you tell people who don't know what RSC is. What is the RSC and what does it do?
Well, the first thing I do is I drop the initials, since there's so many in Washington, D.C., and let them know that it is a Republican Study Committee. I talk about the history. In fact, the last original founder, Sam Johnson, is departing next week. One of the great American heroes, fighter pilot in Vietnam and Korea, beat Buzz Aldrin in a race in their jets. But incredible history. But he is a founder from '73. What it was designed to do coming out of the Nixon era was to make sure that there were a group of House conservatives that were always able to pull the legislation as far to the conservative perspective without killing it. And that's the challenge. I think there is hopefully some skill or art to being able to make sure to know where that line is. What we talk about in our office to try to lay that out is the difference between simply making an argument or making a difference. You see, anybody can make an argument. Go back to the music reference. It's always easy to preach to the choir. But can you take that message to new places, to new communities? And that was the challenge of the Republican Study Committee, which has a wonderful staff. I think most of them are seated to my right today. These are 8 of the smartest, brightest young people that are constantly reading every bill, every suspension bill. How do we craft it in a way? How do we pull it in a way that best meets the conservative ideology of where we believe Americans and how we believe Americans should operate? That's the challenge in explaining both the history as well as the future of where we want to go with it.
Now, one of the big challenges, of course, at any time in American history, I mean, there's no conservative canon. I mean, there's no book out there that says what's conservative and what it isn't. And in fact, over the past couple of years, that's kind of been up in the air, hasn't it? And so figuring out how do you push legislation and public policy as far to the right before it breaks is a pretty tricky thing, because is this way to the right? Is this way to the right? That's going to be the big challenges, right?
It is the challenge, and I think we're at a place where relationships and trust is more important than any time in my lifetime in the political arena. You can have the greatest policy in the world, but if it never reaches the ear of the audience, then what good is it? So what is the conduit that we have to build to be able to make sure that particular conservative policy or that legislation lands in the right place? It has to be built, in my opinion, on the conduit of trust and relationships.
Good. We're going to talk a little bit more about specifics about what's conservative and what isn't, and how the RSC has tried to run the gap a little bit in American politics, and done so quite well, in my view. But in the meantime, tell me more specifically, what are the biggest challenges you've faced over the last 2 years, and then I'm going to go on to your biggest accomplishments.
Well, I think any time, just like you or any of your audience, when you're in a place of making decisions, when you make a decision by proxy, you are making a decision for one group, which means you're now deciding against another group. The challenge of leading an organization like the RSC is that we had 159 members. We had 18 or 19 members of the Freedom Caucus, a dozen or more from the Tuesday group, not to get too much in the wonky or the weeds. That's the moderates and the conservatives.
Okay, so let's be more specific. Yeah. The Freedom Caucus are arguably to the right of RSC, and the Tuesday group are to the middle.
Well, I would think the best way I would think, if I could explain it this way, is the Freedom Caucus of a group of about 30 or 35 members in the Republican Study Committee, we have the same goals. What we do is utilize different approaches or different tactics to accomplish those goals. So I think conservative, I think we're in the same place. The Tuesday group is definitely much more moderate than where the Republican Study Committee. But in those 159, having nearly 20 from the Freedom Caucus, a dozen or more from the Tuesday group, knowing that everything that we had to do was about pulling those guys together and being able to come out with some kind of consensus to be able to move what we felt like both the policy and ultimately the country the most. Probably looking back, that's the biggest challenge, because you've got a lot of personalities and a lot of different people and perspectives on how something should be accomplished. Getting the right tenor and the tone of that was sometimes a little bit of a struggle, but one that I hope that we landed more often than not. When I decided to run for Republican Study Committee, the thought that came to me, Dr. Brooks, was that old Kellogg's Cornflakes commercial from the 90s. I went back and looked it up on YouTube. It was like Taste Them Again for the first time, because they reached a place of maturity stage where they talk in marketing that people begin to walk past it. And I felt like with the Republican Study Committee, people were walking past it. So we came up with the thing, Hear Us Again for the first time. And I think that part of it, infusing that and bringing those kind of personalities together is sometimes challenging, as it is within the organization. But I believe for the most part, we had some victories there.
The Republican Study Committee, the cornflakes of American politics.
I like that, actually.
One point that I want to bring out, and one of the things that I've admired about you over the years, is you just said that the Tuesday Group, the Republican Study Committee, the Freedom Caucus, that they have the same goals, are going about it in different ways, and that's something that we value in the competition of ideas. That's something that America's largely lost. And one of the things that I've heard you say before is that, by the way, we could extend that to the Democrats. That we have goals of trying to lift people up, to bring people together, to create more human dignity, to bring out the potential latent in every person. But we have a lot of different ways about going about that, right?
We do. I was on, if I could mention, on CNN the other day, and they like to talk about the president's posture, personality, tweets, and there's no way to defend all of that, of course. But I tried to pivot a little bit and talk about, I have 3 children. I believe the host had 2, if I recall. And from a husband and a father, a role model, I talked about President Obama and how he had accomplished some things there that we can all admire. I said, but you cannot get away from the fact, from the policy aspect, that there were 12 million more people added to the poverty on those particular policies. In the last 2 years, we've been able to bring out 3.4, 3.5 million people back off of that particular dependency, or whether it's SNAP or other different programs. Ultimately, that's our goal, is to allow people to get out, from my perspective as a person of faith, to pursue the very design that God has for them.
That's terrific. Now, when you came in, Bill Flores, who was the chairman before you from Texas, he gave you some advice. What advice did he give you?
He said, make sure that you, 2 things, include as many different people as we have our own RSC steering committee. You handpick some of those. He gave me the advice to make sure that I'm picking different perspectives instead of just one streamline, which I think was very good. And the other one, he says, make sure you get to know your staff and listen to these guys, because they can add a lot to the plate, and they have.
So what advice are you giving to Mike?
I'm not giving him any at this point.
You're on your own.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, he's got too much potential, and I don't want him to know. I think to Mike is, first of all, he's got already both the experience and the natural ability to lead. You can pick those guys out pretty quick, because people are already listening to this for us when they have something to say. I think that comes from a natural standpoint. But I think if I give him the advice moving forward, it's to continue to figure out how to manage the different factions of the Republican Party, because right now, being in the minority, we need unity more than ever. And to be able to continue to build on that, where we're speaking in one voice, is the advice that I would give him. It's going to be a challenge, but I believe that he can do it.
And you've been a uniter, and so
Thank you.
It's good advice. Mike, over to you. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And why did you run for the spot?
I was recruited to do it. I would not be so presumptuous as a new member of Congress to run for this post, but some people that I really respect within RSC, a large group, came to me and said, this is really not about seniority, it's about skill sets, and you're one of those oddball guys who has this unmarketable set of skills that happen to come together right now for this moment. So
That's a compelling pitch.
Well, yeah, it's pretty compelling. We prayed about it, my wife and I, and we felt like really we were being called to do this. So I jumped in, and it turned out well. My background was in constitutional law, as you mentioned. I was a religious liberty defense litigator for about 10 years. I did policy development for a number of groups. I did messaging, and I've run organizations and all that. So all those things kind of came together. This may be the only place in the free market where this all works and is useful right now, but that's what we're going to do. So,
What are you most excited about?
Our potential. I think that, and I've been saying this since the summer, and I said it during our campaign when I was running for this post among our members, I believe that we are entering what can be the RSC's finest moment since its inception in '73. If you look at the history of the conservative movement, we have often shown our greatest strength at times when we're under challenge. And there's a great legacy of that, and we're the recipients and the custodians of this great legacy that we have, this national conservative movement in this country. I think that we have an opportunity right now to speak with clarity and conviction and consistency about what we believe and why we believe it and why it's best for America. I love what you said earlier. What is conservatism, right? I mean, what does that mean? I did 42 town halls in the last year and a half back home, and I get a great cross-section of people that come to our town halls. The paid protesters stopped coming after the first 4 because we wore them out, so we had very constructive dialogue. And I find, I come from a pretty conservative district in North and West Louisiana, that people who self-identify as conservatives sometimes have a hard time articulating what exactly that means. And even among elected officials, sometimes they can't. So we articulated when I ran for this, I put out to all the RSC members my humble version of what I called the 7 core conservative principles. That if we could all align upon some of these basic ideals that have defined our movement over the years. That's a good starting place for us to work from. And so I said individual freedom, limited government, the rule of law, fiscal responsibility, human dignity, peace through strength.
That's 6.
Something else.
Yeah.
Free markets.
And donating to the American enterprise.
Donating to the American enterprise.
That's always the last one.
That's always the most important, too.
Yes.
That's terrific, because you give this now as the chairman of RSC, gives you an opportunity to try to redefine what conservatism is. What are the threats to the definition of conservatism today, from your view?
I feel like that in some ways we're in uncharted waters as a nation. I think people are becoming more and more, I'd say, disillusioned. They're becoming disoriented. They're becoming confused about what our core principles are. What is the secret to America's exceptionalism? Why are we this unique, extraordinary country? And so the RSC is perfectly positioned. I feel like it's our responsibility to be a very clarifying, guiding light, so to speak, to principle and truth, right? Because that's what we believe, that's what we defend. But we present it in a way that is winsome. We're happy warriors, as you like to say all the time. I completely agree with that. That's how Mark lives his life. That's how I do this. Because we're trying to attract people to our ideology, and you don't do that if you're turning people away, right? And so we have to rebuild, I think, the confidence of our own base, but then we've got to win over a new generation of people to our philosophy. And if we do the messaging well, we do the policy development well, it's well thought, well presented, I think we've got a great moment ahead of us to do that.
So if I hear you, you're saying essentially that a threat to conservatism, as we understand it today, is we have strong values, we have solid values, but we use them as a weapon.
Some people do.
If we can use them as a gift, we'll be more likely to attract other people, whether they disagree with us or not. That's the winsome part, right?
It is, and it has a lot to do with how it's communicated. I love Reagan's farewell address. He famously said, they call me the great communicator, but I'm not a great communicator. I was just communicating great things, and they're the same great things that have animated and driven our country since the time of its founding. Those principles don't change. They're timeless. But we have to present them in a winsome way to new generations of Americans to make them resonate so they understand, they get it in their heart, not just their minds, but in their heart, about why this is the best route for the country.
Okay, so of course there's a lot of disagreement on policy, and there's ideological polarization that we haven't seen like the likes of in a long time. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of data that suggests that ideological polarization is more extreme in America than it's been at any time since the Civil War. I just saw very interesting data that showed that 1 in 6 Americans has stopped talking to a close friend or family member because of politics. That today, for the first time, 40% of Americans say that they would be sorry to see their son or daughter marry somebody from the opposing political party. So, so you're a uniter, and as was Mark. How are you going to knit the country back together from the position of leadership in RSC? How are you going to make America united again?
I believe very strongly in this idea that we've got to just communicate better, go to places where we're not expected to go. We do town halls in every segment of our community and our district, and I do inner city town halls. We invite everybody to come in, and I will stand there and take what you would think would be hostile fire, but it's less and less hostile the longer you stay, because when they can hear what you're really motivated by, it is what you guys are saying, that we're all trying to get to the same place. We want the best thing for the most Americans. We have different ideas of how to get there. We never shy away from debate because we know that our truth is going to prevail in the end, right? So why would you ever not do? We had a lot of Republicans over the last couple of years stop doing town halls, and I thought that was so tragic because this is the most important time ever for us to be going out and engaging the public because the media is not going to present our side. Who will do it if we don't go into those arenas? So I think a lot of it is about relationships, it's about restoring trust and reducing what is often the stereotype about what a conservative Republican is, because they don't know us if they think that.
So as the chairman of the RSC, it sounds to me like you have a commitment not to be pugilistic, but rather to be effectively the happiness caucus of the conservative movement.
I'll take that. I like that. That's what we should do.
Yeah. I think I certainly can imagine a lot of people signing up for that. How are you intending to work with the White House on one side and with Democrats on the other?
It's a lot about relationship. I mean, we have an obvious end with the White House because it's our team in power right now. But when I came in as a freshman, I authored this document called The Commitment to Civility, and we've talked about this before, but we had a retreat among the freshmen. It's 55 members of the freshman class. We went to Williamsburg the couple of days after we took our oaths of office, January 2017, and we got stuck in the resort because it started snowing. We literally got snowed in. We were all stuck together in a room about this size for like 3 days. And so we got to know each other really well. The last session we were leaving, all of us are seated around a huge U-shaped table, and we sent all staff, media, and everybody out. It was just the members. Everybody gave their parting comments after what had turned into sort of a summer camp thing. And the kumbaya moment, everybody goes around the room, no matter where they're from, all across the country, all across the political spectrum, they all say the same thing. I wish we could do our politics different. I hate this tone. I wish we could change it. And it struck me that everybody was saying the same thing in their own words, but the same theme. So I went back to, I'm just jaded enough because I'm a lawyer, I thought that this would dissipate pretty quickly, so I drafted this commitment to civility. It's a one-page summary of all these principles that we'll disagree in an agreeable manner, we treat one another with dignity and respect. If you're arguing the other side of a policy position, you're not my enemy, you're a fellow American, all that. And I sheepishly circulated it to all the freshmen. 53 out of 55 members immediately enthusiastically sign on. When we left for Thanksgiving, we had over 150 members of Congress sign on to this commitment to treat one another with dignity and respect. It's kind of an interesting thing. So we have leaders and luminaries from both sides. I mean, from Kevin McCarthy to John Lewis, right? And if we can continue that on an individual basis amongst new members, going to all the new members and sitting down with them and talking about these principles, I've got some real hope. I'm very optimistic about this.
This is interesting. You know, you find out that nobody knew this, that the freshmen or the members of Congress got stuck in a hotel snowed in. You'd think, based on what we hear about politics, that it would have ended up like the Donner Party or something. You know,
That's right. That's right.
That was a pretty hardcore reference. Sorry, strike that. And you know, it's okay. I'm retiring as president of AEI.
Yeah, you
I
can
can
do
make
it.
these edgy jokes
Freedom.
at this point.
Yeah.
But in point of fact, what you uncovered was that we're tired of hate, that we want to love each other, that we want to respect each other, right? And maybe RSC will be the beginning of the end of the embattled politics, of the culture of contempt that's making things so incredibly unpleasant. By the way, I have data that show that 93% of Americans agree with this.
Yeah.
They just need leadership.
Exactly right.
Is this where the leadership would reside in RSC? Is this your commitment?
We hope so. That's what I'm trying to do.
I like it. I like it from the outgoing and the incoming chairman. That's fantastic. I'm going to bring you both back in on more policy issues and issues of politics as well. We have all agreed and all acknowledged that conservatism is a little bit up in the air right now. What does it actually mean to be a conservative? One of the questions that we have here at AEI is free trade a conservative position anymore? I don't know sometimes, listening to the way politics is running, particularly from the White House. What is the RSC position, and what are your two individual positions? Let's start with the outgoing chairman.
Well, I would hope that free trade continues to be a benchmark. We hear a lot about fair trade, and I understand that there are some rogue players, some bad actors in some of this, and rightfully to call these folks out. But historically, maybe it starts with an education part of this, is understanding the principles of why free trade is such a conservative ideal. If you go back historically, it is what allowed us to be prosperous to begin with, and we're still reaping some of those, the fruits of those labors. But we've got to make sure that people understand that we are not putting some of our industry sectors in a bad position, because once you go after one sector, what is it, the third law of thermodynamics, what happens to one action is an equal and opposite reaction somewhere else. So basically, when you do that, where you create steel tariffs or something else, you're creating another spot, and what happens is ultimately the end result, either two things happen. It either drives up consumer cost, or you have people losing their jobs. And I think that's why we've got to make sure with some of these new language, and I think it was just this morning, we had the USMCA that was drafted. There's some wonderful things about that.
By the way, that's the follow-on to NAFTA.
It is.
That's the new
correct.
NAFTA.
It is the new NAFTA. Mm-hmm. And so we want to make sure there were some good things that Canada opening up their dairy industry to some of our farmers in the north. Those are good things. But we've got to be careful with this tariff. Don't let the word tariff fool you. Tariff is a tax. Mm-hmm. And I think that's when we've got to get back to kind of the thinking where the free trade was. It worked for us decades ago. It can still work for us now.
So Mike, do you feel comfortable as the incoming chairman? I know you're a free trader. I know you feel strongly that free trade is what has, in fact, lifted 2 billion people around the world out of poverty, our brothers and sisters. that abridgments of free trade are generally a mistake? Are you comfortable having the RSC position being something that might not be entirely in agreement with a lot of Republicans, including maybe even some in the White House?
Yes, and I think almost every member that I can think of RSC would define themselves as a free trader as well, understanding it is one of our anchor and core principles and that it's something worthy of defense and better messaging perhaps to explain these principles so people understand why. What's popular isn't always right. What's right isn't always popular, as they told us in 8th grade. That applies here. We got to hold to those core principles and not have it diluted in this kind of crazy political environment we're in.
And Mark said something I think really important, which is it's not. He alluded to the fact that it's not realistic to suggest that something that's a great policy like free trade doesn't actually have deleterious consequences for some individuals, and we shouldn't lack the imagination as conservatives or indeed as policymakers across the political spectrum to find ways for people to adjust. And that's been the lack of imagination in American public policy. So I know you strongly favor vocational and technical education, education reform, ways for Americans to adjust to changes in the economy, and RSC continues to support these things?
Absolutely. I mean, we have to be innovative. In my home district in Louisiana, some of the most effective things we're doing is not only with school choice, the lower levels, but with the technical colleges, community colleges. They're more agile. They're able to adapt to the marketplace better, and so they have tremendous results. And the larger flagship universities are slower to turn and adapt. And so that's kind of the free market in action. As you see, if there's a need for welders, okay, well, let's create a welding program, right? And then it fills up. And they meet the need, and it becomes this sort of symbiotic relationship in the economy, which is how we all theorize this would work. It actually does. And so we need to prioritize those things so we can adapt.
But if you create a subsidy that tries to fill in the gap when you get away from free trade, you're on this proverbial hamster wheel that you never get off.
It's an important point, isn't it? And again, once again, this is going to set those of you who, and RSC, potentially on a collision course with others who call themselves conservatives, but who have a more populist bent, and who are more comfortable with the government doing things that you think are inconsistent with conservative principles. This leads me to my next question. I think that principle number 2 of your 7 was limited government, right?
Right.
Was that 2 or 3? I can't remember.
Number 2, right after individual freedom.
Individual freedom and limited government. And I think you and I would agree that individual freedom and limited government are, opposite sides of the same coin. Right. It's difficult as somebody dedicated to principles of limited government to see the ballooning out of the deficit and a complete abandonment of entitlement reform. Your thoughts? We'll start with Mike and we'll go to Mark.
We have to get back to it as a number 1 priority. The CBO says that entitlement spending, which they define as Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, interest on the debt, right? Those 4 obligations we eclipse GDP in, a dozen years or something. I mean, this can no longer be kicked down the road. You can't wait 8 years to address this. It has to happen yesterday. So we have to have our hand at the wheel and do this. We are completely derelict in our duty. We're rearranging furniture on the Titanic if we don't get this problem under control. And people ask me all the time, what's the most surprising thing about coming to Congress? The most surprising thing is how large. You think of a big bloated government, but you don't really understand how big and bloated it is until you get here and walk the halls. And you realize the behemoth of the federal government is so big and so expansive, it mushrooms every day, even in the last couple of years as we've been able to try to scale it back. It's more than any one person can see or understand, or a group of people can see or understand. It's not what the founders intended. You can't have efficient, effective government if you don't even know what all the government is doing. And it's a kind of a scary prospect. And if we don't begin to scale that back, we're going to lose. We're still an experiment, right, in government, the constitutional republic. We're 242 years into this. We don't know how long it's going to last, and the founders warned us, you've got to keep these things under constraint.
This is an existential threat? Is it your view this is an
absolutely.
To our American way of life?
Absolutely, yeah. Our whole form of government.
And just building off of that, I think it was Mark Twain that said the 2 most important days of your life is, number 1, when you were born, and number 2, when you figure out why. And the progressive policies are such a place that many people never get that second ability or opportunity to figure out why. Because that amount of overreach and lack of limit to government creates a victimization mindset and a dependency. I almost look at this, Dr. Brooks, more from a humanitarian perspective as I do a political one, because when you do not have limited government, you are taking certain segments of our population and saying that we know better than you. And we have a history now of realizing that's not actually the case. And if I could get into the weeds just a little bit deeper and talk about specifically where we've got to attack this at, it is in the mandatory spending components. If you go back to the 1960s and let's put our budget in a pie chart. We had about 27, 28%, if we get in the late 60s, early 70s, that we called mandatory spending. The other is discretionary spending. So we had 70, 75, that infrastructure, that's education, that's defense, all these different items where you had the ability to be able to flex the budget. Now, you fast forward to where we are now, you're closing in high 60s, almost 70% mandatory spending. What is mandatory spending? Two things, interest on the national debt and entitlements. And if we do not have the manpower or the willpower to curve it back, yes, it is a national security issue. We owe China now over $1 trillion of the deficit, or the debt, the national debt. So until we have the ability to say, you know what, we have got, give Congress control of the mandatory side, not the discretionary side, because every year we talk about budgets, we're only talking about the discretionary side, which is a third of what we need to be doing. And until we're willing to tackle the range of the mandatory spending, we will not get this under control.
Now, one of the things that I think probably worth observing, I'm certainly not the first person to observe it, is those who have a philosophical difference with this, I'm referring to our brothers and sisters on the progressive side, disagree. I mean, they think that we could simply raise a lot more revenue because Americans could be taxed more. I get that. But it seems to me that the real threat is the fact that the Republican Party has marched away from these principles. What is RSC going to do to get the Republican Party back on the rails of entitlement reform and limited government and the idea of fiscal sanity as seen in the RSC? Is there a chance that your leadership can do this?
If we don't, then we will be derelict in our duty. That's what RSC was defined to be. It was Ed Follner called it. He was the first executive director of the group, as you know. And back in the day, he said, this is the intellectual arsenal of conservatism. As Steve Scalise said one time, it's the conscience of conservatives in the Congress, right? So it's also the idea and policy shop. So it's our job to create the policy development, the policy ideas that match our core principles that can get us out of this jam. And we take that responsibility very seriously.
And the Republican Study Committee has.
Right.
The primary purpose, the primary piece of policy that the RSC produces is our annual budget.
Right.
Tom McClintock chaired that the last 2 years. We got it to the floor. It received the most votes in history of any other Republican Study Committee budget, getting like 150, 155 votes. And it was a budget that literally balanced in 8 years, 7 or 8 years, if I remember correctly, that began to curb that mandatory spending side. We're going to continue, I know Mike's going to continue making sure that people pay attention to what we're trying to do there budget-wise.
We haven't talked about foreign policy, and I'm going to end on this before I go over to the audience. Tell me how the RSC is thinking about the defense budget and what the defense and foreign policy priorities from the RSC perspective are going to be in the next 2 years. Well, actually, let me start with Mark. What has it? Summarize the last 2 years, and then let's take it to the next 2 years going forward.
In the Republican Study Committee, we have different task forces. We have what we call VAT, which is the Values Action Team. They're the ones paying attention to kind of life, protection, religious liberty. We also have a defense task force, which is managed by Joe Wilson, who has an incredible amount of international foreign affairs relationships. Part of the RSC is one of the key fundamentals is security. We have liberty, but we also have security. Security specifically works with the defense. Now, we did have a little bit of a rub this past year, and being full disclosure, when it came to plussing up the numbers, but also you had the defense hawks. I'm sorry, I'm using DC vernacular. Those that were very important, or their allegiance was making sure the defense was plussed up. Over here on one side of the RSC, we had the fiscal hawks. So we had to try to merge those two, and there was some back and forth before we got to the place, because over the last decade or so, we have seen the defense gutted when we did the President Obama, I believe, $1 for defense, $1 for some social program, and it got to the place where defense was way behind. Half our planes were inoperable. So RSC are big believers in defense moving forward, but we also have to make sure that the budget side is a balance as we go forward.
How did you make that balance over the past 2? Because I know that you did that masterfully.
Yes.
And you were very diplomatic. So explain to us how you had the defense hawks, you had the fiscal hawks. How'd you do it, Mark?
Well, our budget guy was fiscal hawk, but we had to bring in some people that were defense minded as well. So what we do is we laid out our principles, making sure what's the long game, not just for this next budget year. what does it look like long term? And we were able to reach a place, I think it was a little over $700 billion for this upcoming year, making sure that the budget balanced long term, which is 7 or 8 years. The other thing that we added to that, and this was part of our negotiation with both the President as well as Speaker Ryan at the time, is that we would not move forward on the overall defense numbers until we were promised a balanced budget amendment that we could vote on the floor. The RSC was able to secure that earlier in the spring. We were able to pass that. They didn't make it to the Senate yet. So that's the way that you negotiate. When you have a winning argument, which I believe a lot of this is when it comes to fiscal responsibility, you want to maximize it to get as many things accomplished as we could. And I do believe that with the great help of the staff and other members, we were able to get some of that done.
Great, Mike.
So it's about setting priorities. So my district is a great microcosm of the country. I have it's a very conservative area, but it's diverse. Louisiana is a very interesting state, as many of you know. And in my district, I have Barksdale Air Force Base, who's the home of Global Strike Command, 4-star command there, our nuclear triad and all that, and Fort Polk, the Joint Readiness Training Center, 2 major military installations. But I'm also have all my constituents, most would self-describe as fiscal conservatives too. So we're constantly having that balance back home as we are here. We want a strong America. That's our underlying core value here, right? Our principle is peace through strength, as articulated by Reagan and everyone else. We have to have a strong America or we can't do anything else. And so the defense spending has to be a priority. At the same time, we have a nearly $22 trillion federal debt, right? So we have to a realistic approach to this. We are demanding of our top military generals, the Joint Chiefs, more accountability, and they're responding to that. And I mean, my 4-star command back home, they're going in and cutting, pinching pennies at the military, at the Pentagon, because they know that we have to do that. They're on board with it. And so as Congress encourages that along, I believe we can prioritize that spending, maintain the strength and security of America, and reduce the debt at the same time. I don't think they're mutually exclusive pursuits.
And the Republican Study Committee, one more little small point, is the only caucus in Congress that has the chairman or has had the chairman of whether it's HASC, whether it's the defense, whether it's foreign affairs, all of those chairmen are RSC members. So to be able to have those guys at the table in laying this out is a huge benefit.
Right. One point to make that I think is consistent with what you're both saying is, once again, if the RSC view of what the GOP should be doing were fully enforced, which you hope it will be, entitlement reform would occur such that you wouldn't be asking generals to pinch these pennies.
Exactly right.
I mean, we're spending money where we shouldn't be spending money such that we can't where we should.
Exactly.
That's the RSC position,
exactly
correct?
That's why he's Arthur Brooks.
That's right. That's the reason I can't get elected to anything. So now I promised that was my last question. I'm going to turn it over to you, but I do have one more. The big more than cosmetic difference between the leadership of Mark Walker and Mike Johnson is that Mike Johnson is going to be dealing with a different majority, with a Democratic majority. Sum up your position on how RSC is going to work constructively with Nancy Pelosi.
No.
Next question.
So yeah. So
7 principles.
look, we have dual roles in the incoming Congress. This is the reality. We have to play defense very well. We got to hold the line on many of the great strides that we were able to make. Extraordinary run that we had in the first 2 years of the Trump administration, because as they very clearly said, they want to roll all these things back. So much of it. So we have a defensive posture that we have to play, but we're going to be playing offense as well. We're not going to wander in the wilderness for the next 2 years. I'm excited about this. I think this could be our greatest moment. And so while we're developing in our policy shop all of these ideas that we're going to create in our portfolio, our playbook, so to speak, that when we regain the majority in 2 years, which we will, that we'll be ready to run and run those plays. We're also going to try to work with Democrats. I believe we have great relationships with individual members of the Democrat Party in Congress, right? We forge those relationships. I know on an individual basis, there are many Democrats in Congress who want to get things done. They don't disagree entirely with some of even the principles and ideas we talked about this morning, but they're beholden to a kind of an increasingly leftist, progressive, liberal base. And so they're doing a fine dance as well. I think we can work with reasonable members in the Democrat Party and hopefully keep the train on the track, so to speak. And that's our task and our challenge.
And to be quite explicit, Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats are not the enemy.
They're not the enemy. Look, Nancy Pelosi, and I say this in town halls, and when I'm in large Republican groups, they go, I'm in an R13 district as it's rated. But Nancy Pelosi, on an individual basis, is a very kind and generous person. She's been great to me. Come on, she is. I'm sorry, folks back home, she is. Look, she has a different idea of how to get to the end goal than I do, and I accept that. But my role as a conservative is not to launch grenades at the other side and regard them as an enemy. She's my fellow American. She's doing, in I think, every case, what she genuinely believes to be the right course. I think it's madness, her ideas. But what my challenge is to go with her, build a relationship, she and others like her, to try to convince them of the correctness of our arguments. You can't do that unless you have a dialogue. The founders envisioned this to work. They knew that you would have fiery brands and great, deep philosophical differences, and that people would come around, but they would be willing and able to sit around a table and arm wrestle over what is the best consensus to build the most for the most Americans, right? I'm never going to compromise my core principles. I will not. But I have to compromise preferences sometimes, or else we don't continue this thing moving forward. And that's our challenge, to be able to work with the other side, the ones who are reasonable and want to do what's best for Americans, and convince them that our ideas are the best.
No, so what you're saying is that getting less than 100% of what you want is not the same as losing.
Reagan said, I'd rather get 80% of what I want than go over the cliff with the flag waving, right? That's where Huckabee said one time, he was running for governor of Arkansas, and I loved it. It was one of my animating principles. The hostile leftist media was attacking him, and they said, well, you're too conservative. And the first thing they said is, you're a Southern Baptist. You think only Southern Baptists are going to heaven? He said, ma'am, I'm more narrow-minded than that. I'm not even sure all the Southern Baptists are getting there, is what he said. But then he said, look, I'm a conservative, but I'm not mad at anybody about it, right? I mean, that's how you do things. It's how you do things. It's how I do it. I'm not mad at anybody about this. I'm a conservative because I know and believe that our core principles are best for the country. And so I'm going to advance that with conviction, but I'm going to try to present it in every scenario, even when I'm with Nancy, in the most winsome way, so that we can convince that broader audience out there, the American people, that our side is right.
Over to the audience. Now, again, the ground rules are you got to wait for the microphone so that our friends on TV can hear you. So, Nathan, I'm going to start with you, and we're going to come up to the front. Gentleman right here in the... And the next question after that is right next to you.
Great. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. John Bird with Miller Winhold Capital Strategies and John Pelletier and Associates. From a process-oriented look ahead to next Congress, the RSC has always had an open door to coalitions, issue groups, trade associations, professional societies. Whether it's big-ticket items like infrastructure or other items next Congress, do you see any way to tweak or upgrade outreach and how to mobilize, leverage the different coalitions that have partnered with the RSC in the past?
Yeah, to give you the inside baseball, Mark has done a great job with this. There's an exceptional foundation, but we're doubling down on that because I feel like it's more important than it will ever be when you're in the minority to have those coalitions built. And so we're doing a fine-tuning on that. He and I have talked a lot about this, and others who are helping to lead the organization. We're digging in very deeply with our allied organizations, with all the outside groups that are like-minded, so that we can maximize all those resources and that wellspring of expertise, because it's mutually beneficial for all those groups, for us and for the movement and for the country ultimately. So it helps RSC and its members of Congress, to advance our agenda, obviously, when we maximize those relationships. But it helps us to expand the message as well. And so we're very intentional about that. I've already started it. I'm going to the heads, I call the heads of state, the heads of all the allied organizations individually. We're going to have some group meetings and some brainstorming sessions. And we're going to continue that dialogue over the next 2 years because it's critically important to us. Absolutely.
Right next to you, and then we'll over here and then over there.
Good afternoon. My name is Todd Wiggins. My website's called meetmedc.com. I'd like to tempt you with a perennial question, if I may. That probably would go to either of you. The theory that if we work together, therefore we spawn a group in between. In other words, if the Democrats and Republicans are more cooperative or attempt to be, then that might spawn some kind of a more collaborative group in the center, i.e. a third-party system, which has not seemed to have taken off in any district anywhere in the U.S. Is it plausible that we could see this in our lifetime, where a three-party system could be more beneficial to the growth of our country?
I don't know. My first impulse is to say I don't think so. Mike talked about this, the 80%, 20% rule. You want to make sure that you're not only getting 20% and calling it 80%, so you want to make sure that those things get across the board. But when I first came to Congress, Chris Christie said this. He said it's, and I don't agree with everything he says, but this resonated. He said it's harder to hate up close. And I've thought about that many, many times. Are we getting up close to be able to share what it is we believe, or are we spewing it from a bullhorn from Washington, D.C. back home to our districts? That is crucial, more than the fact as far as maybe coming together in the center on ideals, because I believe we have the truth on our side. I believe in these things. I'm passionate about it. The highlight of my time in Congress has not been policy. It was 6 months ago when I became the first Republican ever invited to keynote and speak at the North Carolina Legislative Black Caucus Foundation. The reason why that's important is to be able to have the posture and the credibility to talk about these ideals in different places. Not the fact that you move at what you believe and try to find, but how do you best share what it is that you believe in the different environments, in the different places. That would be my emphasis, as opposed to trying to always try to find exactly where the middle ground is.
Why did they invite you?
Partly because of our work with historical black college universities. I happen to represent the largest North Carolina A&T, which is the largest, but specifically we launched the first ever paid internship in Congress for HBCU students. A lot of, and just being frank, the urban area are not exposed to some of the Republican principles or orthodoxy that we believe in. So we said, let's compete on ideas. Let's spend 6 weeks in a Republican office, 6 weeks in a Democrat's office, and allow that young student that's coming out into full adulthood to be able to say, I've seen it both perspectives. It's not what I saw in the media, wasn't what I saw whether it's Fox News or MSNBC, but I was able to literally work in the member of the U.S. Congress office, both sides, to be able to say which ideas competing put forth the best perspective of moving forward.
You know, I've heard you say on a number of occasions, you probably will never vote for me, or you may not, but I'm going to fight for you and your family, whether you vote for me or not.
I think we have to believe that.
Indeed, indeed. Right here.
Lou Gagliano, Coalition to Transform Advanced Care. My question is on health care. Let's assume for the moment that the tax bill is neutral, doesn't raise any more money, that we don't lose any more money. How do you bring the health care into line, given what you're trying to achieve, as you said in your budget for 7 years? I mean, how do you correct that deficit?
Well, you know, we had a comprehensive repeal replace effort that ultimately failed on the Senate floor, and a lot of work went into that, a lot of discussion, a lot of effort on everybody's part. There are some components of that bill that I think would have actually helped truly solve the problem, that would have driven costs down, given more care across the board to more Americans that was more accessible and higher quality. Not to get too deep in the weeds, we don't have time, but the main model I thought was a good one. You know, when they did the risk-sharing pool and they put a small surcharge on every private policy each year, put the money into a pile, and they used that for chronic illnesses, cancer patients, and the like. And that experiment, it was a free market experiment in effect, but it worked. And in Maine, they had great results. This was, I think, 3 years before Obamacare became the law of the land. There are some ideas out there like that will work, but we have to take a risk to be able to apply that across state lines and price transparency and so many different things. I don't know what the prospect is of us getting a comprehensive reform bill now, but I do think that Republicans are doubling down on our effort to fix it, even if we do it in a piecemeal fashion. We have to do something. It's the other big thing that keeps us up at night, next to the debt, is this ballooning cost of health care. And in my district, it's becoming unsustainable. I mean, just healthy young families of four are paying more for health insurance than they are for their mortgage, and it goes up every year. And so we've got to do something. This is the other big monkey on our back, so to speak, and it has to be addressed.
Robert Dorr, and then you, ma'am, after Robert Dorr.
Thank you. It's Robert Dorr from AEI. One piece of legislation that you're going to vote on this month is the Farm Bill, and it looks like what's going to come over is not going to have the work engagement requirements that the House supported, making sort of any kind of real reform in the SNAP program not be in the bill. Yeah. How are you going to react to that?
Yeah, I've been trying to keep low-key this morning. So I'm still, it is the insane part of Washington, D.C. So here's the numbers, all right, and I'll do this maybe in 30, 40 seconds. The last two farm bills have driven people into poverty from the total amount of 28 million to about 43 million, okay? And now, starting with the premise that the Farm Bill, what it's called, 85% of it is SNAP welfare. Only 15% is actually a farm bill. So if we know that under those conditions that more and more people are losing opportunities, why in the world would we want to put some kind of work provision to better, this is about hope, not judgment. And the fact that we do not have the scruples to be able to say, we don't want to be castigated as far as being, why wouldn't we want to help people? Why? I think of Psalms 139, how every individual is created wonderfully and has talents and abilities. Why don't we want to see our fellow brothers and sisters get the opportunity to perceive that by building on-ramps? Whether you do a merge, whether you do a time over there's so many different ways to do that. And to see that, I'm getting a little elevated, sorry. So to see this guy strip this out, even some of our guys on the Senate side, I think does a disservice to every family, to every boy and girl in this country.
So why are, because you said, well, why in the world would we? So why are we losing the work requirement for food stamps?
We are afraid of the narrative that is being created that Republicans are these mean guys that don't want to help this person, don't want to help this person. And I understand that a little bit, but if you've got data points, Dr. Brooks, that you can go back and say, okay, here's the last two, okay? The last two drove this many more people into poverty or full-time dependent on SNAP, then wouldn't it make common sense that maybe we shouldn't do the same thing for the third time? Because as you know, the Farm Bill, it's renewed over 5 years, so we don't get another opportunity to fix this for another 5 years. And that's why I've been so passionate and so outspoken that this must be, the RSC was ringing the bell on this, 6 or 7 months ago, team, when we started saying, be careful of this because this is going to be crucial as far as how we improve one specific area, going back to the mandatory spending again. This was an opportunity that I'm afraid that we're missing.
Arthur, the reason that we've lost this one is partially because of messaging, what Mark's touching on, is that we have presented this issue under the core principle that it's about fiscal responsibility. Of course it is. But this one also falls, I think, more importantly, under the core principle of human dignity, because as Mark's articulating, it's better for people to give them the dignity of work, to force them off the couch with the video games. I mean, able-bodied men, 18 to 49, who don't have dependents, don't have any health care problems. They should be working. This is, by the way, is an issue that polls over, I think, 85, 86% across the country. It's a common sense proposal. It's the right thing for the individuals. It's the right thing for the country in every way. But we have not presented that message well, and so we lost that battle. I think that that's the perception on the Senate side. We've lost that battle in the public square, and so they're not willing to take that tough vote. And it's a crying shame, and it's going to be a great problem amongst the RSC membership.
Now, one of the core principles that the Republican Study Committee can put forth morally is this idea that people are assets, not liabilities.
Right.
And the current legislation suggests that poor people are liabilities. As such, you treat them like charity cases. You ship them out with their food stamps. You would expect nothing from them as people, whereas you would never treat your children like this, right?
Exactly right.
So this is as much a messaging problem as anything else. By the way, it's much cheaper just to write people checks than it is to expect work.
Sure.
And so as a matter of spending less money, it might be a kind of a collusion between left and right to treat poor people like liabilities as opposed to assets in the broader human family.
Sad but true.
That's what ultimately you have to deduct that if you're doing the same thing over and over again.
Right here in the back, yes, ma'am.
Hello, my name is Sanna Kangasharju. I work at the European Parliament office here. I'd actually like to repeat a question that you put, but it got a bit lost. What are the foreign policy priorities of the RSC, and how do you see the role of the US in the world? Thank you.
Well, it's part, everything to me springs from one of the core principles, and of course, peace through strength. We have to have good coalitions. We have to have good alliances with other nations. It's interesting, I'm teaching a college course right now at night, and it's constitutional principles and free enterprise. It's like a 200-level undergrad course. I just do it kind of to stay sharp. And
where are you teaching it, Mike?
Liberty University is online, biggest online program in the world. And it's a very conservative curriculum because it's a conservative institution. But we had an essay recently, and I had my students write an essay, 3 pages on Washington's farewell address. And he gave a warning in the farewell address about foreign alliances and how you don't want to become too dependent upon that and all these things. We've crossed a lot of those lines a long time ago. But in terms of foreign policy, I think we've got to maintain strong connections. I think the president has that in mind. His America First idea is a good concept. I'm not sure he unpacks that and articulates it the same way that we would. But it's not, I don't think we should go full bore into nationalism. I think we have to have a realistic picture This is a very close-knit world right now. We are still the greatest superpower. We're the greatest nation on the planet. We ought to act like it. And I think when we project strength and build those relationships, it's good for not only our security and our prosperity, but everybody around the world. So it's kind of a general answer, but we could get way deep in the weeds on this.
So your view is that the more nationalistic sentiment of Fortress America is misguided. You would like to see a more expansive conservative position a la Ronald Reagan, which you and Mark and I grew up with,
right,
that suggests that America is a gift to the world and a guarantor of democratic capitalism, much more so than we're currently seeing?
That's well said, yeah. I believe that.
Thanks. That's a provocative position, by the way. And
I know it is.
And one
it's
that,
controversial.
By the way, one that certainly my colleagues and I would welcome. We'll come right here, sir, and then after that we will go to you, and then back in the back.
Thank you. Bill Veal. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer. I came in late, and I don't know, but was immigration off limits?
There's nothing off limits in the American Enterprise Institute.
All right. Well, I'd like to ask about immigration. Where does that stand? I mean, from the spectrum of a comprehensive treatment to piecemeal packages and so forth. Could you expound on that and maybe some past thinking on how to do better in the future?
Sure. I think it's certainly a sensitive area. I happen to have been fortunate to have the background where I've worked in refugee camps across the world. So from a compassionate standpoint, I think hopefully our record stands on itself. So at the same time, we do have a situation that is a growing concern. Let's take the hot topic of the day and talk about the Caravan and then draw it out from there a little bit in the time that we have. We've now been able to identify over 600 criminals in this group. We are now at a place where we are arresting 10 terrorists a day at our borders. This is documented by the Department of Homeland Security. I don't know how well we're doing the messaging part of that, but we do have a responsibility. It's the very first oath Mike and I take is to protect the citizens of the United States of America. If you look at the amount of drugs that are being smuggled in at the border as well, and I know this is more of an immigration issue, but why it's important from a border security standpoint, last year alone, I seized 828,000 pounds of drugs. 2,360 pounds of that was fentanyl, enough to kill every boy and girl in North America, not just our country. So we have to have, there's two parts of this. You have to have the border security, but you also have the interior enforcement component that's got to be spot on. And we got close. We had 193 votes on a piece of legislation that, interesting enough, for the first time, they didn't bring all the committee chairs. They brought all the caucus chairs together to kind of iron out. I'll catch up with you a little bit afterwards because there's about 2 or 3 points in this as far as where we need to go. But I do believe that we need to make sure that our borders are secure, not in a strong man or strong arm way, but to be able to have, we take in 1 million people per year, immigration-wise. Let's continue to do that. But let's also make sure that people are doing it the right way.
And messaging is critical too here. And as I said, I was in an interview last week on Fox News. I said, we're a compassionate nation, but we're also a nation of laws. And if we don't maintain the latter, we cannot be the former. The only reason that we are the great beacon of the world and we're the great compassionate people and all is because we're strong enough to do it. And a strong America is in the interest, as I said a moment ago, not just our security and prosperity, but everybody around the world. So if we don't have sovereignty, if we don't have strong borders, we don't have a country, and none of this is possible. So everybody ought to buy into this principle.
Daniel Crocker. Mike, coming to you.
Thanks. Dan Crocker with the American Foreign Service Association, also active Foreign Service with the Department of Commerce. On the foreign policy side, we're facing a couple of challenges at least, right? And just to pick a couple, one related to migration is the Venezuela crisis. It's going to be a big challenge for us. Another one might be Chinese mercantilism in Africa and Latin America in a way that threatens geopolitical interests, not just building ports, but real geopolitical interests. When we look at this, we don't necessarily turn first to military options, although that spear always has to be sharp at the tip, right? We're looking for diplomatic solutions. And so I'd be interested in hearing RSC's position on funding and fully staffing out a field-forward force around the world.
I'll do the short answer, give you since you work in that particular on the committee as well. A lot of times conservatives will reach out to us and they will say, you need to cut off foreign aid to this country, to that country, and this country. If that's your background, you will know how intricately involved and important that is to keep us in a diplomatic perspective as opposed to having to go, well, let's just hit this button or send fighter jets or put special forces on the ground. That is something that is crucial. It's one of the ways diplomatically, to use your word, that we've been able to push back on some of these uprisings, whether they're in Eastern Europe, whether they're in the Middle East. That is something that we need to continue to do. Now, I'm not for sending a bunch of cash in a cargo plane to people who hate us. I don't think I need to draw that out any further. But there are places.
What are you referring to, sir?
that where diplomacy is the better route. It's where Reagan had that special touch. Gorbachev tear down that wall. He had designed and built the credibility to be able to say that. And I think diplomacy, as humanitarians, as people of good faith, as Americans, that's always should be our first impulse. I know you work in that specific committee, Mike. I'll tell you.
I do, and we have 15 seconds left on the clock. But I'll just say that China clearly was not a fair trading partner. We have problems there, right? But as we've been saying, and we say to the White House, and we say amongst ourselves, you deal with this with a scalpel and not a sledgehammer, which is what Mark's talking about. We really believe in that. It is intricate, delicate balance. We have to maintain stability in all these, tinderbox areas around the world. I like the idea of a forward force. It would have to be clearly defined, but that could be very strategic for us. And we have to think differently about these things because, as I said, not only domestically but internationally, I feel like in so many ways we're in uncharted waters, and so we might have to break the mold on some of these things.
As we close, I'd like to reiterate my admiration for the mission of the Republican Study Committee and these gentlemen. These are the ideas that animate a lot of you, no matter what your political views are, that there is an equality of human dignity in the world, that there's a limitlessness to human potential, that America is a gift to the world that can bring that out here and all around the world. There should be a competition of ideas in the way to get that done. That competition should be respectful. It should be kind, because that truly is in the American spirit. I think that we can count on that, a resurgence of those values that we see emanating from the Republican Study Committee. And to that end, I'd like to ask all of you in joining me in thanking Mark and congratulating Mike and all members of the RSC.